I was sitting on my porch in Wilmington, North Carolina, enjoying my Saturday morning coffee when I heard the unmistakable sound of metal being struck with considerable force. The hollow clang echoed through our quiet suburban neighborhood, and I instinctively knew something was very wrong. I set down my mug and walked toward the end of my driveway, only to find Patricia Henderson, the president of our homeowners association, standing next to my mailbox with an aluminum baseball bat in her hands. My mailbox was visibly dented, the black metal post bent at an awkward angle, and the box itself had a massive dent running along its side. Patricia was breathing heavily, her face flushed red, and she was staring at my property with what I can only describe as triumphant rage. I stood there for a moment, completely stunned by what I was witnessing. This was a woman in her early 50s, always dressed in business casual attire even on weekends, who had made it her life's mission to enforce every single HOA rule with an iron fist. "What the hell are you doing?" I finally managed to say, my voice louder than I intended. Patricia whipped around to face me, the bat still gripped tightly in both hands. Her perfectly styled blonde hair barely moved in the morning breeze, and her lipstick was applied with surgical precision despite the early hour. She pointed the bat at me accusingly. "Your mailbox is 3 inches too far from the curb according to Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws," she said, her voice shrill and self-righteous. "I've sent you 3 violation notices in the past month, and you've ignored every single one of them. This is what happens when residents think they're above the rules." I looked at my mailbox, then back at her, trying to process what she had just said. "So your solution was to attack my mailbox with a bat? Are you completely insane?" "I'm enforcing community standards," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "If you won't fix violations voluntarily, the HOA has the right to take corrective action. You'll be receiving a bill for the removal and replacement of this non-compliant mailbox, plus administrative fees." I felt my blood pressure rising. I had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, and Patricia had been a constant thorn in my side. She had fined me for having my trash cans visible from the street 15 minutes past the designated time, sent me violation notices for having a garden gnome that was apparently too whimsical for neighborhood aesthetics, and once threatened legal action because my grass was allegedly 1 inch taller than the maximum allowed height. But this was beyond anything she had ever done before. "You just committed vandalism," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "That's a crime, Patricia. You destroyed my property." She laughed, actually laughed, as if I had just told the funniest joke she had ever heard. "It's not vandalism when the HOA is enforcing legitimate rules. I have legal authority here. You signed the covenant when you bought your house, which means you agreed to abide by all regulations. This mailbox is non-compliant, and I'm well within my rights to have it removed." "By smashing it with a bat," I was nearly shouting now. "That's not how any of this works." "I'll be documenting this entire interaction," Patricia said, pulling out her phone. "Your hostile attitude and refusal to comply with HOA regulations will be noted in your file. Expect another fine for threatening behavior toward an HOA board member." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman had just vandalized my property and was now threatening to fine me for being upset about it. I was about to respond when I noticed movement from the house next door. My neighbor, Tom Richardson, was standing on his front porch with his phone pointed in our direction. He gave me a slight nod, and I realized he had been filming the entire encounter. Tom was a retired police officer who had moved to the neighborhood about 6 months ago. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and a calm demeanor that came from decades of dealing with difficult people. We had become friendly, often chatting over the fence about sports or grilling techniques, and he had mentioned more than once that he thought Patricia was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Patricia noticed Tom filming and immediately changed her demeanor. She lowered the bat and took a step back, attempting to look more composed. "Good morning, Tom," she called out with forced cheerfulness. "Just handling some HOA business here, nothing to be concerned about." Tom walked down his porch steps, still holding his phone. "Morning, Patricia. I happened to catch the last few minutes on video. Pretty interesting approach to code enforcement you've got there." Her smile faltered. "I was simply addressing a mailbox violation. This is standard HOA procedure." "Standard procedure involves assault with a weapon now?" Tom asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. "Because from where I was standing, I watched you strike that mailbox at least 4 times with that bat. That's textbook vandalism, maybe even criminal mischief." Patricia's face went pale, then flushed an even deeper red than before. "I have authority as HOA president. This isn't vandalism, it's enforcement." "I'm sure any court would agree that an HOA has the right to address violations on community property." "Except mailboxes aren't community property," Tom said. "They're owned and maintained by individual homeowners. You just destroyed private property, Patricia. And I've got the whole thing on video, including your admission that you did it because you were upset about HOA violations." I watched as Patricia's confident demeanor began to crack. She looked between Tom's phone and my damaged mailbox, clearly trying to figure out how to spin the situation in her favor. "This is being taken completely out of context," she said. "I was acting on behalf of the entire community. The HOA board will back me up on this." "We'll see about that," I said, pulling out my own phone. "I'm calling the police right now." Patricia's eyes widened. "You're overreacting. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. The police won't even respond to something like this." "Let's find out," I said, already dialing. The next 20 minutes were tense. Patricia tried to leave, but Tom politely suggested she might want to stay and explain her actions to the responding officers. She reluctantly agreed, though she spent the entire time making phone calls to other HOA board members, presumably trying to build support for her position. I took photos of my damaged mailbox from multiple angles and made notes about the entire encounter while it was still fresh in my mind. When the police arrived, 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached us. The older officer, whose nameplate read Martinez, listened carefully as I explained what had happened. Tom offered to show them the video he had recorded, and they watched it on his phone with growing interest. "Ma'am, is this you in the video?" Officer Martinez asked Patricia. "Yes, but this is an HOA matter," she said quickly. "I was enforcing community standards as is my right and duty as the association president. These gentlemen are blowing this completely out of proportion." The younger officer, Officer Chen, was examining my mailbox. "This is significant damage. Looks like it's going to need complete replacement." "How much would that cost?" Martinez asked me. I pulled up a quick search on my phone. "A decent mailbox and post like this one runs about $250 plus installation. Probably around $340 total." Martinez nodded and turned back to Patricia. "Ma'am, destroying someone's mailbox isn't considered HOA enforcement. That's vandalism. The fact that you used a bat to do it makes it even more serious." Patricia's face was now completely white. "I want to speak to my lawyer." "That's your right," Martinez said, "but first I need to see some identification. We're going to have to file a report on this, and depending on the circumstances, there may be charges." I watched as Patricia fumbled for her wallet, her hands shaking slightly. The confident, authoritative woman who had been wielding a bat 20 minutes ago now looked small and frightened. Officer Martinez took her information and spent several minutes talking with Officer Chen in low voices near their patrol car. When they returned, Martinez addressed all of us. "Here's what's going to happen. We're filing a report for vandalism and criminal mischief. The victim, he nodded toward me, can pursue charges if he chooses. Miss Henderson, you're free to go for now, but you'll be hearing from us. I strongly suggest you contact an attorney. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. She gave me one last furious look, climbed into her silver BMW, and drove away. The bat was left lying on my lawn, and Officer Chen bagged it as evidence. After the police left, Tom and I stood in my driveway, looking at my ruined mailbox. I can't believe she actually did that, I said. I mean, I knew she was intense about the HOA stuff, but this is crazy. Tom shrugged. People like Patricia, they get a little bit of power and they think it makes them untouchable. I've seen it 1,000 times. She probably convinced herself that she really was acting within her authority. Do you think anything will actually happen to her? I asked. Or will she just lawyer up and make this go away? With video evidence? She's in real trouble, Tom said. That footage shows clear intent, admission of the act, and her justification for doing it. Any prosecutor would love a case this clean. Plus, she basically admitted to multiple harassment incidents with those violation notices she mentioned. I thanked Tom profusely for filming and for staying to give a statement to the police. He waved off my gratitude, saying he was just doing what any decent neighbor would do. After he went back inside, I spent the rest of the morning dealing with the aftermath. I called my insurance company to report the vandalism, took more detailed photos, and started researching what my legal options were. By that evening, word had spread through the neighborhood about what had happened. I received texts and calls from at least a dozen neighbors, some offering support, others asking for details, and a few expressing shock that Patricia had finally gone too far. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had problems with her enforcement tactics, though I was apparently the first person she had physically attacked. My next-door neighbor on the other side, Jennifer Wu, came over with a bottle of wine and her own stories about Patricia's reign of terror. She fined me $300 because my son left his bicycle on the front lawn overnight, Jennifer said. It was one time, and she threatened to put a lien on my house if I didn't pay immediately. I was terrified, so I paid it, but I've resented it ever since. Another neighbor, Marcus Webb, stopped by to tell me that Patricia had once called code enforcement on him, claiming he was running an illegal business from his home. I'm a freelance graphic designer, he explained. I work from my home office. She apparently thought that violated some HOA rule about commercial activity. Code enforcement came out, looked at my setup, and told her she was wasting their time. She tried to fine me anyway for misuse of residential property. The stories kept coming, and I realized that Patricia had created an atmosphere of fear and frustration throughout the entire neighborhood. People were constantly worried about minor infractions, about leaving their trash cans out too long, about having the wrong color of flowers in their gardens, about parking in their own driveways in ways that Patricia deemed unsightly. It was exhausting just hearing about it. On Monday morning, I received a call from a detective at the Wilmington Police Department. Detective Sarah Brooks asked if I could come down to the station to give a formal statement about the incident. I took a long lunch break from my job as an accountant and drove downtown. Detective Brooks was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She had me walk through the entire incident in detail, asking specific questions about Patricia's statements, her body language, and whether I had felt threatened. I answered everything as accurately as I could, and she seemed satisfied with my responses. We're moving forward with charges, she told me, criminal mischief and vandalism. With the video evidence and your testimony, plus the statements from your neighbor who witnessed it, we have a strong case. The district attorney will be in touch with you about restitution. What does that mean? I asked. It means you'll be compensated for the cost of replacing your mailbox, Detective Brooks explained. If Miss Henderson is convicted, part of her sentence will likely include paying you back for the damage she caused. You'll need to get quotes for the replacement and submit them to the DA's office. I left the police station feeling a mixture of vindication and anxiety. I had never been involved in a criminal case before, even as a victim, and the whole process felt overwhelming. But I was also relieved that the system was taking Patricia's actions seriously. Over the next few days, I got quotes from 3 different contractors for mailbox replacement. The estimates ranged from $320 to $365. I went with a mid-range option that came in at $340, which included a new mailbox, post, installation, and painting to match my house's color scheme. Meanwhile, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. I wasn't on the board, but several neighbors who were called me afterward to fill me in on what had happened. Apparently, Patricia had tried to present the mailbox incident as a misunderstanding, claiming she had been trying to measure the distance from the curb when she accidentally struck the mailbox with the bat she was carrying. The board members didn't buy it, especially after several of them watched Tom's video. She was asked to resign, Jennifer told me over the phone. 3 of the 5 board members voted to remove her as president immediately. She refused and threatened to sue the HOA for wrongful termination. It was a complete mess. Can she sue? I asked. Her position is voluntary, Jennifer said. She's not an employee. The board has the authority to remove officers who act inappropriately. Her lawyer probably already told her she doesn't have a case, but she's not the type to give up easily. The following week, I received a letter from Patricia's attorney. It was a cease and desist letter demanding that I drop all charges against his client, claiming that my actions constituted harassment and that Patricia had been acting in good faith as an HOA officer. The letter threatened to countersue me for defamation and emotional distress if I continued to pursue the matter. I immediately called the detective and then consulted with my own attorney, a friend from college named David Park who practiced civil law in Raleigh. David read the letter and laughed. "This is nonsense," he said. "You can't defame someone by reporting an actual crime they committed. And her emotional distress claim is absurd considering she's the one who showed up at your house with a bat. Don't respond to this letter at all. Let the criminal case proceed." As the weeks passed, my new mailbox was installed, and I submitted the invoice to the district attorney's office as part of my restitution claim. The neighborhood slowly started to return to normal, though the tension around HOA matters remained high. A new interim president was appointed, a mild-mannered retired teacher named George Sullivan, who immediately announced that the board would be reviewing all HOA rules and enforcement procedures. "We want this to be a community again, not a police state," George said at a neighborhood meeting I attended. "There will still be rules, of course, but we're going to focus on the things that actually matter, like maintaining property values and ensuring safety. Nobody's going to get fined because their garden gnome is too whimsical." That comment got a big laugh, and I felt myself relaxing for the first time in months. Several neighbors came up to me after the meeting to thank me for standing up to Patricia, saying they wished they had been brave enough to do it themselves. The court date was set for late spring. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Michelle Torres, called me to discuss the case. She explained that Patricia had rejected a plea deal that would have included probation, community service, anger management classes, and restitution. Instead, she was insisting on going to trial, apparently convinced that she would be vindicated. Her attorney advised her to take the plea, Michelle told me, but she refused. She genuinely believes she didn't do anything wrong. In a way, That works in our favor because it means the jury will hear her try to justify vandalism as HOA enforcement. As the trial date approached, I grew more nervous. I had never testified in court before, and the thought of being cross-examined by Patricia's attorney was intimidating. Michelle assured me that with the video evidence, my testimony would mostly just be confirming the basic facts of what happened. The trial took place on a Tuesday morning in May. The courthouse in downtown Wilmington was an imposing brick building, and I felt my stomach churning as I walked through the metal detectors and made my way to the courtroom. Tom was there as well, since he would be testifying about the video he had recorded. Several of my neighbors had also come to watch, showing their support. Patricia arrived with her attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Robert Crawford. Patricia looked different than I remembered. She was still dressed impeccably, but there was a hardness to her expression that hadn't been there before, or maybe I just hadn't noticed it. She didn't look at me as she took her seat at the defense table. The jury selection process took most of the morning. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, waiting to be called. Tom kept me company, telling stories about interesting cases he had worked on during his time as a police officer. It helped distract me from my nerves. Finally, the trial began. Michelle gave her opening statement, laying out the facts of the case in clear, straightforward terms. The defendant, Patricia Henderson, took it upon herself to destroy the victim's property because she believed his mailbox was not in compliance with HOA regulations. Rather than following proper procedures, she showed up at his home with a baseball bat and struck his mailbox repeatedly, causing significant damage. This isn't code enforcement. This is vandalism. And the evidence will show that beyond any reasonable doubt. Robert Crawford's opening statement tried to paint Patricia as a dedicated community servant who had been driven to desperation by my repeated refusal to comply with neighborhood rules. Miss Henderson spent years trying to maintain the standards and property values of her community, he said. She sent multiple violation notices that were ignored. She attempted to work with the defendant to resolve the issue. When all else failed, she made an admittedly unorthodox decision to address the problem herself. Was it the right choice? Perhaps not. But her intentions were good, and she believed she was acting within her authority as HOA president. I was called to testify first. Michelle walked me through the events of that Saturday morning, asking me to describe exactly what I had seen and heard. I explained how I had been sitting on my porch when I heard the sound of metal being struck, how I had found Patricia standing next to my damaged mailbox with a bat, and what she had said about enforcing HOA rules. "Did you feel threatened by the defendant's actions?" Michelle asked. "Yes," I said. "She was holding a bat and had just destroyed my property. I didn't know what she might do next." "Had you received violation notices about your mailbox before this incident?" "Yes, 3 notices in the previous month," I confirmed, but they seemed ridiculous to me. The mailbox had been in the same location for 3 years without any issues. I honestly thought the notices were another example of the HOA being overly strict about minor details. "Did you ever imagine that ignoring those notices would result in your property being destroyed?" "Absolutely not," I said. "I thought the worst that would happen would be another fine or maybe a hearing with the HOA board. I never imagined someone would show up with a bat." During cross-examination, Robert Crawford tried to make me seem like an irresponsible homeowner who had flagrantly disregarded community rules. "Isn't it true that you had been cited for multiple violations over the years?" he asked. I had received violation notices for things like having my trash cans visible 15 minutes past the pickup time, or having grass that was allegedly too tall by an inch, I said. Minor things that I didn't think warranted the level of attention they received. But you did receive those notices, and you did fail to address them promptly. I addressed them when I felt they were legitimate concerns, I replied. But yes, sometimes I questioned whether the violations were reasonable. Crawford spent several more minutes trying to portray me as a difficult neighbor, but I could tell the jury wasn't particularly sympathetic to his argument. After all, even if I had ignored some HOA notices, that didn't justify someone destroying my property. Tom was called next, and he was an excellent witness. His background as a police officer gave him credibility, and his calm, factual testimony about what he had observed and recorded was compelling. Michelle had him narrate the video as it played for the jury, and I watched their faces as they saw Patricia striking my mailbox with the bat, heard her justifying her actions, and witnessed her attempt to threaten me with additional fines. In your professional opinion as a retired police officer, was the defendant's action a lawful exercise of HOA authority? Michelle asked. Absolutely not, Tom said. HOA authority extends to issuing fines, scheduling hearings, and in extreme cases, filing liens or taking legal action. It does not include physically destroying property. What I witnessed was vandalism, pure and simple. Crawford tried to shake Tom's testimony during cross-examination, but Tom was unflappable. He had seen decades of defense attorneys trying similar tactics, and he calmly stood by everything he had said. The video spoke for itself, and there was no way to interpret Patricia's actions as anything other than intentional property destruction. The prosecution rested its case after Tom's testimony. Crawford called Patricia to the stand, and I watched as she took the oath and sat down. She looked composed, almost serene, as if she were completely confident in her position. Crawford led her through a series of questions designed to establish her dedication to the community, her frustration with non-compliant homeowners, and her belief that she had been acting appropriately. Patricia described years of dealing with residents who refused to follow rules, who let their properties deteriorate, who made the neighborhood look shabby and uncared for. I devoted countless hours to maintaining our community standards, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I sent notices, I held meetings, I tried to work with people. But there are always those who think the rules don't apply to them. Mr. Johnson's mailbox was measurably non-compliant. It was 3 inches too far from the curb, which might not seem like a big deal to some people, but it's a violation of our covenant. If we let one person get away with it, soon everyone will be ignoring the rules. What were you thinking when you went to his house that morning? Crawford asked. I was thinking that something needed to be done, Patricia said. I had tried everything else. He wasn't responding to notices, wasn't attending hearings. I thought if I removed the non-compliant mailbox, he would be forced to replace it with one that met our standards. I didn't think of it as vandalism. I thought of it as enforcement. Michelle's cross-examination was devastating. She started gently, asking Patricia about HOA procedures for dealing with violations. Patricia confidently explained the normal process: notices, hearings, fines, and eventually legal action if necessary. And at what point in that process does it become acceptable to show up at someone's house with a baseball bat? Michelle asked. Patricia hesitated. That's not exactly what happened. Really? Because we have video of you holding a bat, standing next to a damaged mailbox. What am I missing? I was frustrated, Patricia admitted. I had followed all the proper procedures and nothing was working. I made a mistake in judgment. A mistake in judgment, Michelle repeated. Miss Henderson, how many times did you strike the mailbox with that bat? I don't remember exactly. The video shows at least 4 distinct strikes. Does that sound accurate? Patricia's composure was starting to crack. Possibly I was upset. Upset enough to commit vandalism. I wasn't committing vandalism, I was enforcing community standards. Michelle let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Miss Henderson, do you own the mailbox you destroyed? No, but as HOA president, I have authority over. Do you have authority to destroy private property? In certain circumstances when enforcement requires, please answer yes or no. Do you have legal authority to take a baseball bat and destroy someone's mailbox because you believe it's 3 inches out of position? Patricia was silent for a long moment. I believed I was acting appropriately. That's not what I asked. Did you have legal authority to do what you did? I had authority to enforce HOA regulations by destroying property with a bat. Patricia's face flushed red. He wasn't listening. None of them listen. I spend hours every week dealing with violations, sending notices, trying to keep this community from falling apart, and people like him just ignore everything I say. Someone has to maintain standards. Michelle let Patricia's outburst speak for itself. The jury had just witnessed the defendant admit that she destroyed property because she was frustrated that people weren't following her rules. It was exactly the kind of moment prosecutors dream about. Crawford tried to rehabilitate his client during redirect, but the damage was done. Patricia's testimony had essentially confirmed everything the prosecution had claimed. She had intentionally destroyed property. She knew it was wrong, but she felt justified because of her position as HOA president. The closing arguments were brief. Michelle summarized the evidence, emphasized the video testimony, and reminded the jury that positions of authority don't grant people the right to commit crimes. Crawford made an impassioned plea for leniency, arguing that Patricia's intentions were good even if her methods were flawed, but even he seemed to recognize that the case was lost. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreperson announced that they had reached a verdict. I felt my heart pounding as the judge asked Patricia to stand. On the charge of vandalism, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of criminal mischief, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. I watched as Patricia's face went completely white. She grabbed the table in front of her for support, and her attorney put a hand on her shoulder. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled a sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later. As we left the courtroom, several of my neighbors who had attended congratulated me. Tom shook my hand and said, "Justice served." I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I was glad that Patricia had been held accountable for her actions, but I also couldn't help thinking about how someone had let power go to their head so completely that they ended up destroying their own life. The sentencing hearing was much quicker than the trial. Michelle presented evidence of Patricia's lack of remorse and her history of aggressive HOA enforcement. She recommended jail time, probation, and restitution. Crawford argued for probation only, emphasizing that Patricia had no prior criminal record and had already suffered significant consequences, including losing her position as HOA president and becoming a pariah in her own neighborhood. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Catherine Reynolds, clearly wasn't impressed with Crawford's arguments. "Miss Henderson, you held a position of trust in your community," she said. "Rather than using that position to serve your neighbors, you used it to terrorize them. When one of your neighbors didn't comply quickly enough with your demands, you showed up at his home with a weapon and destroyed his property. Your testimony at trial showed not only a lack of remorse, but a fundamental belief that you were entitled to take the law into your own hands. That's deeply troubling." Judge Reynolds sentenced Patricia to 90 days in jail, with 60 days suspended, meaning she would serve 30 days. She was also placed on 2 years of probation, ordered to complete anger management counseling, and required to pay $340 in restitution to me for the cost of replacing my mailbox. Additionally, she was ordered to perform 200 hours of community service, and prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position during her probation period. Patricia was led away by the bailiff, and I watched as she disappeared through a side door. Crawford approached me as I was leaving the courtroom. "My client would like to apologize," he said quietly. "A little late for that," I replied. "She's going to have to pay your restitution before she can be released. Can you provide your banking information to my office so we can arrange the transfer?" I gave him my attorney David's contact information instead, not wanting to deal with Patricia or her lawyer directly. David handled the payment arrangements, and within a week of Patricia's sentencing, I received a check for $340, along with a terse one-sentence note that said, "Payment in full for Mailbox Restitution." Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. George Sullivan proved to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on actual community issues rather than nitpicking minor infractions. The covenant rules were revised to be more reasonable, with clearer definitions and processes. Several of the more ridiculous regulations, like the restrictions on garden gnomes and the incredibly specific grass height requirements, were eliminated entirely. Tom and I became even closer friends after everything that had happened. We started having weekly barbecues in the summer, and several other neighbors joined us regularly. The sense of community that had been crushed under Patricia's reign slowly began to rebuild. About a month after Patricia was released from jail, I saw her at the grocery store. She was in the produce section, and I was debating whether to acknowledge her or pretend I hadn't seen her. Before I could decide, she walked over to me. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly. "A real one, not just through my attorney." I was surprised. "Okay." "I convinced myself that enforcing the rules was the most important thing," Patricia continued. "That if I didn't maintain standards, the whole neighborhood would fall apart. I let that belief justify behavior that was completely unacceptable. What I did to your mailbox was wrong. What I did to a lot of people in the neighborhood was wrong. I'm sorry." She didn't wait for me to respond. She just nodded once and walked away. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. It wasn't a perfect apology, and it didn't undo the damage she had caused, but it was something. Maybe the counseling and jail time had actually made an impact. I ran into Jennifer a few days later and mentioned the encounter. She told me that Patricia had been slowly reaching out to various neighbors, apologizing for her behavior. "She's moving away," Jennifer said. "Selling her house and relocating to Virginia where her sister lives. I think she finally realized that she can't stay here after everything that happened." The for sale sign appeared in Patricia's yard the following week. The house sold quickly, probably because it was one of the nicest properties in the neighborhood despite all the drama surrounding its owner. I never saw Patricia again after that encounter at the grocery store. The new family who moved into Patricia's old house were wonderful people, a young couple with 2 small children who were friendly and easygoing. They asked me about the neighborhood, and I gave them an honest assessment. "It's a great place to live," I said. "The HOA used to be a problem, but it's much better now. Just follow the reasonable rules, and you'll be fine." Tom hosted a welcome barbecue for the new neighbors, and nearly everyone on the street attended. It felt like a celebration not just of new neighbors, but of a new era for our community. People were laughing, kids were playing in the yard, and there was a sense of relaxation that I hadn't felt in years. As I sat on Tom's back deck that evening, watching the sun set and listening to the sounds of people enjoying themselves, I thought about how much had changed since that Saturday morning when I heard metal being struck. Patricia's attack on my mailbox had been a shocking and frightening experience, but in a strange way, it had also been a catalyst for positive change. The neighborhood had been living under her authoritarian rule for so long that nobody had really questioned whether things could be different. Her dramatic overreach had finally broken that spell. The criminal case had established important precedents too. The HOA board had adopted new policies making it crystal clear that enforcement actions must follow proper procedures, and that no board member had authority to damage or remove property without following legal channels. George had even brought in an attorney specializing in HOA law to review all our governing documents and ensure everything was above board. My mailbox, ironically, had become something of a neighborhood landmark. The new one I had installed was actually nicer than the original, and several neighbors had jokingly referred to it as the mailbox that brought down a tyrant. I didn't mind the jokes. If anything, I was glad that people could find humor in what had been a difficult situation. The $340 Patricia paid in restitution was sitting in my savings account. I had thought about what to do with it, and finally decided to donate it to a local charity that helped people dealing with legal issues. It felt right to take something negative and turn it into something positive. My work as an accountant kept me busy, but I made more time for neighborhood activities after everything that had happened. I joined the HOA board, not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to help ensure that what Patricia had done would never happen again. We needed reasonable people making reasonable decisions, and I figured I could contribute to that. The probation period for Patricia stretched on for 2 years, though she was no longer living in the state. I occasionally wondered how she was doing, whether she had learned anything from the experience, whether she had found a way to channel her desire for order and control into something more constructive. I hoped so, for her sake and for the sake of anyone who might become her neighbor in the future. One afternoon, about a year after the trial, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Patricia, forwarded through her attorney's office. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a handwritten note on simple stationery. "Dear Mr. Johnson," it read, "I wanted to write to you now that I've had time to reflect on everything that happened. I've been working with a therapist who specializes in control issues and obsessive behavior. She helped me understand that my need to enforce rules came from a deep fear of chaos that stems from childhood experiences. That's not an excuse for what I did, just an explanation. I genuinely believed I was helping the community, but I see now that I was actually hurting it and hurting people. I hurt you, and I'm truly sorry. I hope you can find peace in knowing that I'm working to be a better person. I hope the neighborhood is thriving without me. Sincerely, Patricia Henderson." I read the letter twice, then filed it away in a drawer. It was a more thoughtful and introspective apology than the one she had given me at the grocery store. I appreciated that she had taken the time to write it, and I believed she was sincere. But I also knew that the best thing for everyone was that she had moved on and we had moved on. Summer turned to fall, and the neighborhood prepared for Halloween. George organized a community trick-or-treating event with designated safe hours and volunteer monitors at major intersections. It was the kind of positive HOA activity that actually brought people together rather than pushing them apart. Kids from all over our section of Wilmington came to our streets because word had spread that we gave out good candy and that it was a fun, safe environment. I carved pumpkins with Tom and some of the other neighbors, and we lined our driveways with them. On Halloween night, I must have handed out candy to over 200 kids. It was exhausting but wonderful. This was what a community was supposed to feel like. As November approached, I realized that it had been almost a year since Patricia had shown up at my house with that bat. The trauma of the experience had faded, replaced by the positive changes that had come in its wake. I no longer felt anxious every time I saw an HOA notice in my mailbox, because I knew they would be reasonable. I no longer worried about being fined for trivial violations, because the new board focused on things that actually mattered. The annual HOA meeting that November was remarkably different from previous years. Under Patricia's leadership, the meetings had been tense affairs where she lectured residents about violations and threatened consequences for non-compliance. Under George's leadership, the meeting was actually pleasant. He presented a financial report showing the HOA was in good shape, discussed upcoming projects like playground improvements and street repair, and opened the floor for resident questions and suggestions. Several people spoke up with ideas for community events and improvements. There was a genuine spirit of collaboration that I had never experienced before in an HOA meeting. When the meeting ended, people lingered to chat rather than rushing out the door as quickly as possible. "This is nice," Jennifer said to me as we stood in the parking lot of the community center. "I actually enjoyed coming to an HOA meeting. I never thought that would happen." "George deserves a lot of credit," I said. "He completely changed the culture." "You do too," Jennifer replied. "You stood up to Patricia when a lot of us were too scared. If you hadn't pressed charges, she would probably still be terrorizing all of us." I hadn't thought of it that way, but she had a point. By refusing to back down, by insisting that Patricia be held accountable for her actions, I had helped break the cycle of fear she had created. It was a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but one I was glad I had taken on. Winter came, and with it the holidays. The neighborhood looked beautiful with Christmas lights and decorations. Under the old regime, there had been strict rules about holiday displays, including approved color schemes and maximum wattage. George had simplified the rules to basically just nothing offensive and no fire hazards. The result was a much more diverse and interesting display of holiday spirit. I put up multicolored lights and an inflatable snowman that my nephew had given me as a gift. Under Patricia's rule, both would have been violations. Now they were just part of the neighborhood's charm. On Christmas Eve, Tom and I were sitting on my porch drinking hot chocolate when a patrol car drove slowly past. The officer inside, who I recognized as Officer Martinez from the original incident, rolled down his window. "Evening, gentlemen," he called out. "Just wanted to stop by and see how things are going." "No more mailbox attacks, I hope?" "All quiet on that front," I replied with a laugh. "HOA has been great lately." Martinez smiled. "Glad to hear it. That case made the rounds at the station." Everyone got a kick out of the HOA president going down for bat-based enforcement. It's become a training example of how positions of authority can lead to criminal behavior if people aren't careful. "Happy to contribute to law enforcement education," I said dryly. "Have a good holiday," Martinez said and drove off into the night. Tom raised his mug of hot chocolate. To quiet neighborhoods, reasonable HOA boards, and no more assault mailboxes. I clinked my mug against his. "I'll drink to that." As the year came to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened. A single act of vandalism had spiraled into a criminal case, a conviction, and ultimately a transformation of an entire community. Patricia Henderson had lost her position, her freedom temporarily, her reputation, and ultimately her home. I had gained a stronger friendship with Tom, a voice on the HOA board, and a deeper appreciation for what it means to stand up for yourself and others. The $340 restitution I had received seemed like such a small amount compared to everything that had happened, but it represented something important: accountability. Patricia had been forced to literally pay for the damage she caused, and that tangible consequence had been part of what drove her to finally acknowledge her wrongdoing. The new year brought new challenges and opportunities. The HOA launched several initiatives that George had proposed, including a neighborhood watch program, regular community social events, and a beautification committee that actually focused on helping people improve their properties rather than punishing them for minor violations. I volunteered for the social events committee and helped organize a spring block party. In March, almost 18 months after the mailbox incident, Patricia's probation was scheduled to end. I received a notification from the district attorney's office informing me that her sentence had been completed without any violations, and that the case was now officially closed. I filed the notice away with the other documents from the case. A few weeks later, I received one final communication from Patricia. It was an email, brief and to the point. Mr. Johnson, I wanted to let you know that my probation is complete. I've finished my counseling, completed my community service, and paid all my fines and restitution. I'm starting a new job as an administrative assistant for a nonprofit that helps people with housing issues. I'll be working with people to navigate regulations and access resources, rather than enforcing rules against them. It feels like the right kind of work for me now. I hope you and the neighborhood are well. Thank you for holding me accountable. I needed it, even though I didn't want to admit it at the time. Best regards, Patricia. I read the email and felt a sense of closure. Patricia had gone through the criminal justice system, served her sentence, and come out the other side apparently changed for the better. Whether that change would last was up to her, but at least she had been given the opportunity to learn and grow from her mistakes. I typed a brief response. Patricia, I appreciate you reaching out. I'm glad you're finding meaningful work that allows you to use your organizational skills in a positive way. I wish you well. The neighborhood is thriving under new leadership. Take care. I hit send and closed my email. That chapter of my life was now truly finished. The mailbox that had started everything stood sturdy and undamaged at the end of my driveway, exactly 3 inches from wherever Patricia had thought it should be, though nobody cared about that anymore. Spring arrived with blooming flowers and warmer weather. Tom and I resumed our weekly barbecues, and the neighborhood kids played in the streets as parents chatted on lawns and driveways. The community that Patricia had tried to control through fear and intimidation had transformed into a genuine neighborhood where people looked out for each other and actually enjoyed living. The block party in April was a huge success. We closed off the street, set up tables with food, hired a local band, and invited everyone in the surrounding area. Nearly every household participated, contributing dishes or helping with setup. George gave a short speech thanking everyone for making the neighborhood such a great place to live, and there was genuine warmth in the applause that followed. As I stood there watching children chase each other in games of tag, neighbors laughing over shared meals, and the community coming together in a celebration of simply being neighbors, I thought about how easily things could have gone differently. If Tom hadn't been filming that morning, if I had been too intimidated to press charges, if the criminal justice system hadn't taken the case seriously, Patricia might still be wielding her bat both literally and figuratively over all of us. Instead, justice had been served. Not just legal justice, though that was important, but a deeper kind of justice that came from a community reclaiming itself from someone who had abused power. The $340 Patricia paid to replace my mailbox was the least of what she owed. But it was also the most important because it represented acknowledgement that she had been wrong and that actions have consequences. My mailbox still stands at the end of my driveway, a silent testament to the day an HOA president went too far and learned that even positions of neighborhood authority come with limits. Every time I check my mail, I'm reminded of how far we've come as a community and how important it is to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The neighborhood continued to thrive. Property values increased as word spread that we were a desirable place to live with a reasonable HOA and a strong sense of community. New families moved in, attracted by the welcoming atmosphere and the balance between maintaining standards and allowing personal expression. Each time new neighbors arrived, someone would inevitably tell them the story of the mailbox incident, usually with a mixture of humor and disbelief that it had actually happened. My role on the HOA board became more significant over time. I was elected vice president in the following year's election, and I worked closely with George to ensure that the positive changes we had implemented became permanent fixtures of how the association operated. We codified new rules about enforcement procedures, established an appeals process for violations, and created transparency requirements for board decisions. The baseball bat that Patricia had used to attack my mailbox remained in police evidence for a while, but eventually it was returned to her as part of closing the case. I sometimes wondered what she did with it. Maybe she kept it as a reminder of her worst moment, or maybe she threw it away, trying to forget. Either way, it no longer had any power over our neighborhood. Tom eventually shared the video he had recorded with me, and with his permission, I saved a copy. I never posted it online or shared it publicly, but I kept it as a record of what had happened. Sometimes, when I doubted myself or wondered if I had overreacted, I would watch the video again and be reminded that I had done the right thing. Patricia's actions that morning had been clear, deliberate, and wrong, and no amount of justification about HOA enforcement could change that. The seasons continued to cycle through. Each summer brought more barbecues and outdoor gatherings. Each fall brought Halloween celebrations and preparations for winter. Each winter brought holiday lights and community. Each spring brought renewal and growth. And through it all, my mailbox stood at the end of my driveway, a constant reminder of the day everything changed. Years would pass, and new neighbors who didn't know the history would see just an ordinary mailbox on an ordinary street in a pleasant neighborhood in Wilmington, North Carolina. But those of us who remembered would always know that it represented something more. The moment a community decided that rules without reason were tyranny, that authority without accountability was abuse, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up and say, "Enough." Patricia Henderson had come to my house with a bat, intending to enforce her vision of order and compliance. Instead, she had sparked a transformation that made our neighborhood stronger, kinder, and more genuinely community-oriented than it had ever been under her leadership. The $340 in restitution she paid was just money, easily earned and easily spent. But the lesson learned, the changes made, and the community rebuilt were priceless. As I sit on my porch now, drinking my morning coffee and watching the neighborhood come to life with people heading to work, children waiting for school buses, and neighbors waving to each other in passing, I feel grateful for how everything turned out. The mailbox incident was traumatic and stressful, but it led to positive change. Patricia faced consequences for her actions, but was given an opportunity to change. The neighborhood learned to stand together against unreasonable authority, and I learned that sometimes doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, can make a real difference. The mailbox stands. The neighborhood thrives, justice was served, and life goes on better than before in a community that learned the hard way that true leadership means serving others, not controlling them. The dent Patricia left wasn't just in metal and post. It was in the consciousness of everyone who witnessed or experienced her authoritarian approach to neighborhood governance. But just as my mailbox was replaced with something better, so too was the leadership style that had caused so much unnecessary stress and fear. In the end, $340 bought more than a new mailbox. It bought accountability, justice, and ultimately peace. And every time I check my mail, walking down my driveway to that sturdy black mailbox that stands exactly where it should, I'm reminded that standing up for yourself and holding people accountable for their actions isn't just the right thing to do for yourself. It's the right thing to do for everyone around you who might be suffering in silence, waiting for someone to be brave enough to say that enough is enough.